And I speak to you tonight. I'm Australian, I'm also German, I'm a dual citizen, and I'm not religious, I'm basically atheist. I call myself an atheist Jew, which might sound confusing, but we can discuss that later if you'd like. And also anti-Zionist. And what that means, of course, is a Zionist is someone who believes in the concept of a Jewish state, which could be in many places, but it is now currently, of course, in the Middle East. And I now define myself as someone who's anti-Zionist, who does not believe in the concept of a Jewish state because by definition it discriminates against non-Jews. And my feeling about that is not that dissimilar, to be honest, to an issue around a Muslim state or a Christian state or any religious state, a Hindu state, for example. Much of this book, which I'll get to in a minute, talks about the current situation in India and its relationships with Israel. And India is increasingly becoming a Hindu fundamentalist state, and I'm equally against that kind of configuration as well. So the issue is not that it's a Jewish state, the issue is it's any religious state, which by definition discriminates against people who are not of that faith, Jewish, Christian, Hindu, whatever you may be. And I've been thinking and writing about Palestine for a long time. If you're Jewish, you really can't avoid it. I grew up in Melbourne. This is not going to be a long potted history, but just a bit of background. I grew up in Melbourne in the 70s, and my family, most of whom were killed in the Holocaust, a sadly typical common Jewish story for those who were living in Europe. The ones who got out, the ones who escaped, came in 1939 to various countries around the world, including here in Australia. And when I was growing up by the 1970s, Israel was something you just supported, you believed in. It wasn't really hugely questioned. Of course, there were people who did. But in general, it was seen as a safe haven. God forbid something happened to the Jews again. For those who don't know in this room, if you are Jewish, you can go to Israel, and assuming you can prove, so to speak, that you are Jewish, which basically means you have a Jewish mother and you were born Jewish or you converted in a certain way, you can be an Israeli citizen within a handful of months. And of course those same rights are not granted to Palestinians who have, in my view, much greater connection to the land. But nonetheless, I could become, although I'm not, an Israeli citizen. So I've been thinking and talking about these issues for decades. And the book is not principally about my own views. My views are discussed at the beginning of the book to give readers a bit of a sense of who I am and my background. And that was a decision that my publisher and I decided to have, to give a bit of context for what is happening in Palestine today and how there are growing numbers of Jews who are critical of what's happening because it's being done in our name. Israel claims to speak for all Jews. Israel itself, through its leadership and others in the Jewish community here, regularly says Israel and Zionism and Judaism are the same thing. There is no difference. There's no separation. If you're one, you must be the other. And it's true that the majority of Jews probably would call themselves Zionists. That's true. But growing numbers of Jews are deeply concerned here and overseas, and this of course is in the wider community too, not just Jewish people, about what's happening in Palestine, what's happening today in Palestine, what's been happening for 75 years in Palestine. And I guess the genesis of the book, for me, was I've been visiting Israel-Palestine for 20 years, roughly, since 2005. I've been reporting there every 3 or 4 years since then in Israel, Gaza and the West Bank for various outlets here and overseas. And in 2016 to 20, I was living in East Jerusalem with my partner and our young son. And in some ways, I guess I was interested in doing a book or an investigation initially in understanding a conflict that is, as was said in the introduction, in the media all the time. There's very other few conflicts that get as much coverage. The war in Ukraine at the moment obviously does, various other conflicts here and there. But in general, this is an issue which gets covered over and over and over again. I would argue often very badly, which I talk about in the book, but it's covered. And yet too often the conflict is just reported as there's two sides, they both hate each other, why can't they just get along? I'm simplifying it, but that's often what it comes down to. And I was interested in trying to understand and explain why that issue was, or that framing was wrong, A, and B, to explain that what Israel is doing in Palestine. It's been occupying the West Bank and Gaza for 56 years, and East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. It's the longest occupation in modern times. And through those decades, Israel has developed a range of tools and technologies to maintain that occupation. What does that mean practically? In the modern age, we're talking about surveillance technology, so-called smart walls, facial recognition technology, biometric data, drones in the modern era. All these tools and technologies that are used to control Palestinians, to divide them. And in the last years, an issue that many in this room will probably have heard of is Pegasus. Pegasus is an Israeli spyware made by a company called NSO Group. And essentially what the spyware does is a government or government department around the world can buy this technology. And it allows them to essentially control your phone. I'm talking about a mobile phone, Android or iPhone. All the contents of your phone can be captured, taken, without you knowing. Emails, photos, everything. You can turn your phone off and your camera and microphone can still be used against you. It can record information without you even being aware of it. Now, the reason this is relevant, apart from the petrifying concept of surveillance in your pocket, is this idea that this tool has ended up in the hands of some of the worst regimes on the planet, sold by Israel. We're talking about everyone from Saudi Arabia, Rwanda, UAE, parts of the Indian government. There are so many examples of this. And I interview in the book, in fact, a number of individuals who had their phones surveilled. Now, this is not a weapon that kills people, but it's a weapon that profoundly undermines your own belief in the concept of privacy. If you're a journalist, if you're a human rights worker, if you're a human, which hopefully includes most of us here, then these days, for better or worse, your phone is a massive part of your life. Maybe it shouldn't be, but it is. And the idea that all the information on that phone can be taken and used potentially against you is a pretty scary thought. So this got a lot of attention in the last years, as many people here will know. And I was interested in exploring the issue in a much bigger way, because Pegasus is but the tip of the iceberg of what Israel's been doing in Palestine for decades. Those tools and technologies often are tested and trialled in Palestine on Palestinians, so-called battle-tested on Palestinians. Now, if you think that sounds unreasonable or crazy or what is he talking about, I would say a few things to that. I guess we might get to that in Q&A. But the idea of battle testing weapons is not the only thing that Israel does. The US, for example, after 9/11, battle test weapons in Iraq and Afghanistan. They openly say so in the current war in Ukraine going on today. The US and other Western allies are testing weapons in the field. They're saying it, they're promoting it, they're marketing it, they're trialling it there, they're saying it openly. So it's not a secret. What Israel is doing in Palestine, though, the difference with that is a fundamental one. Israel has had on its doorstep for more than half a century a captured population. A population that is being divided. There are now 5 million Palestinians, roughly, in the West Bank and Gaza. And for much of the last 56 years, although in many ways an occupation of sorts started in 1948 when Israel was founded, Palestinians have not had equal rights. For those who are not aware, if you are a Palestinian living in the West Bank, you are treated as a second-class citizen. You cannot vote in an Israeli election to elect a leader who controls your life. You are controlled by a corrupt Palestinian leadership. In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, in Gaza, Hamas. And I've spent time with both those organisations, and I can assure you, as a reporter, I'm no defender of those corrupt political organisations at all. They're both a disaster for the Palestinian people, but let's not forget the key point. The occupying power is Israel. It's not the Palestinians. The Palestinians are not occupying themselves. They're being occupied by Israel. And another reason I wrote the book, to give a bit of context, is so many global conflicts are about an issue that is happening in a geographically set place. So I've spent a lot of time in the last 20 years reporting on conflicts across the globe, so from Afghanistan to Honduras and elsewhere. And as horrific as those conflicts are, whether it's a war in Afghanistan or a drug war or gang war in Honduras, they're generally based around geographic borders. What's happening in Palestine is not. What's happening in Palestine is happening within the borders of Palestine, but it's exported around the world. Israel is now the 10th biggest arms dealer in the world. It has sold defence technology to over 130 countries, so the majority of nations in the world, democracies and dictatorships. And I go through in the book, and I won't go into big detail now, but I go through in the book a potted history of the kind of regimes that Israel has assisted and worked with and trained and armed in the last roughly half century. Pretty much every single, the most repressive regimes on the planet. So we're talking about Chile under Pinochet. We're talking about the most repressive regimes in Latin and South America in the 70s and 80s. We're talking about a regime, for example, in Guatemala that was committing genocide against its own indigenous population, being armed and trained by Israel. We're talking about apartheid South Africa, one of the worst regimes of the last half century, which ended officially in 1994, and one of its key allies for its entire history was Israel. And it was not just a defence relationship. It was partly that, but it was an ideological alignment. And this is why the South Africa-Israel relationship is so central to what's happening now, as much as that regime in South Africa ended decades ago. It was an ideological alignment, and I have lots of information and details and quotes and documents in the book to explain this. Both countries admired what the other were doing to their repressed population. Israel deeply admired what South Africa was doing to its black population and said so, publicly and privately. And South Africa deeply admired what Israel was doing to the Palestinians. They were getting inspiration from each other. Both sides thought they were fighting a war against barbarism. On one side, of course, it was against the black population in South Africa, and in Palestine, of course, it was against Palestinians. And I have in the book lots of information to explain what this practically meant and why that's relevant in 2023. And it's relevant because that ideological alignment is now taken on a whole new 21st century reality. South African apartheid is over. That country faces huge problems today. There's an economic apartheid of sorts, to be sure. But officially, apartheid ended in 1994. What is happening today in the 21st century is Israel has become a key global inspiration of ethno-nationalism today. Now, what does that practically mean? It means that, say, as I talk about a lot in the book, that Israel and India is now the world's biggest country with the world's biggest population, the world's biggest self-described democracy, although I would question that, but that's what it claims for itself. It is run by a Prime Minister Modi, who our Australian Prime Minister seems to be in love with in a deeply embarrassing way. Deeply embarrassing, but that's mostly the case with our Prime Minister, sadly, these days. Prime Minister Modi is a Hindu fundamentalist. It's pretty uncontroversial to say that. You wouldn't say that in India in front of him, because he hasn't had one press conference ever in his entire existence as Prime Minister since 2014. And again, I would say that the Israel-India relationship today is the Israel-South African apartheid relationship of yesterday. And what do I mean by that? Yes, it's a defence relationship. India buys huge amounts of weapons, defence equipment, spyware, so-called smart walls from Israel. That's part of it. But it's much more than that. It's an ideological alignment. Indian officials under Modi, and Modi himself, have talked extensively about deeply admiring what Israel's doing in the West Bank, wanting to do similar things in Kashmir to the Muslim majority population. So what India is doing in Kashmir in the last years is bringing in huge numbers of Hindus from the south of the country to settle and occupy the Muslim areas of Kashmir. Now, I'm not saying India is doing that solely because of Israel. They're not. But again, a deep ideological alignment. And to me, one of the great threats of this century is ethno-nationalism. One of the great threats today is that issue. And we have the world's biggest country and the world's biggest self-described democracy as a proud ethno-nationalist state. Under Modi, India is proudly talking about becoming a Hindu fundamentalist state. If people question or doubt that, I would urge you to read. There is so much to read and hear about this issue. There is regular pogroms backed by the state against Muslims across India today. This is India. This is not saying it's every single Indian, obviously, but I'm talking about the Indian government under Modi is creating the conditions for mass violence against Muslims. And this is the nation that we, as Australia, as the US, as the West, is partnering with. Why? Because they're not China. Now, isn't that a lovely, comforting thought? But it's important to remember that a key friend and ally of India is Israel. And right until the end of apartheid South Africa, when the entire world had finally turned against South Africa, which country do you think was with them right to the end? I'll give you a guess. Starts with I, ends in L. Israel. And there's a reason for that. There's an ideological alignment. It wasn't just because of arms sales. That was part of it. It wasn't just that. It was up here. It was a belief that what South Africa was doing was right. And if you question that again, there is copious amounts of information, evidence, declassified documents, much of which is in the book, which explains that. And this is the issue today with India and Israel. And India is far more powerful than South Africa under apartheid ever was. And yet there is too much, not just cheerleading in the Australian press, and frankly most of the Western press, towards India, but a willful blindness to what is happening in that country. And Israel is a key partner, as is Australia and the US too, of course, in what Modi is trying to do. I want to give a few other examples of where Israeli technology, defence equipment and spyware tested first in Palestine on Palestinians is now ending up. And there are lots of other examples, but let me give you a handful. During, not before, during the Rwandan genocide in 1994, Israel was selling weapons to the regime there. During, both before, during and after the Myanmar genocide against the Rohingya people in the last 5 years, Israel was selling spyware and defence equipment to the regime in Myanmar. Saudi Arabia has bought spyware and defence equipment from Israel extensively. It was found, Pegasus was found on the phone of Jamal Khashoggi, the Saudi journalist who was cut up in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul in, I think it was 2018, correct me if I'm wrong. The UAE, huge amounts of defence equipment and spyware. Bangladesh. The EU, and this is also something I've talked extensively about. The EU in the last years, since the so-called migrant surge in 2015, they made the decision they did not want to have that so-called problem again. They're happy to accept white Christian refugees, and let's be clear, in the last years, much of Europe has been happy, and I have no problem with this, by the way, accepting Ukrainian refugees who clearly are in need after the Russian invasion last year. My issue is not with that. The issue is that Europe has created a so-called fortress Europe, of which Israeli drones, let me explain why, are a key part of that. Over the Mediterranean in the last years, you have 24/7 Israeli drones being used by the EU, Frontex, which is the so-called border force of the EU, flying 24/7 above the Mediterranean, the eyes in the sky, watching what is happening on the water, watching huge numbers of boats coming, mostly brown and black and Muslim bodies, and also many Africans, mostly the Middle East, Muslims or Africans. And the EU has made a decision, unofficially of course, to let people drown. Like, that is the policy now. They rescue very few people. They barely send any rescue boats out anymore. There's a handful of NGOs that are trying to rescue people. They're clearly massively outnumbered. That's the policy, to let people drown. Now, I think that's profoundly amoral for a so-called civilized part of the world, but there you go. And the Israeli drones are a key part of that infrastructure. They are watching 24/7 over the Mediterranean, sending all the images about what they're seeing to Frontex headquarters in Warsaw in Poland. So the Israeli infrastructure is a key part of the EU's border fortress. Their drones are unarmed. They're not shooting people out of the water yet. But to me, this is and I talk about this a lot in the book, the border industrial complex is part of what Israel is so good at, and I use that term loosely. Along the US-Mexico border in the last years, you have huge numbers of Israeli surveillance towers dotted all across the border, made by a company called Elbit, which is Israel's leading defence company. Elbit's also involved in Australia too, but along the US-Mexico border, that's a central part of the US border so-called security. And it's important to note on this issue that this is not particularly a Democrat or Republican issue. There was huge amounts of, in my view, rightly so, fear and anger about what Trump was doing on the border and what Trump was doing everywhere, really. But so much of what I'm talking about on the border has not changed as much as people would like to think with Biden. In fact, much of it remains remarkably similar. Remarkably similar. There's not a sort of trumpeting of building an actual physical wall, as Trump was seemingly obsessed with, but there's a plan to build a high-tech digital wall. Not a physical wall necessarily, but a digital wall. And Israeli tech is part of that. And why would America want that technology? Because it was first tested in Palestine. You have Elbit infrastructure across the West Bank and across the Israel-Gaza border. You have a company called Cellebrite in Australia. Cellebrite is an Israeli so-called security company, but it's most known for phone hacking tool. So around the world you have police departments, governments buying this Cellebrite tool that essentially allows anyone to have their phone hacked. If you think that your iPhone or Android is secure, you can, if that makes you sleep at night, then that's nice for you, but actually it's very easily hacked, either remotely or physically face-to-face. Cellebrite is purchased by some of the worst regimes in the world. It's being used by Russia against dissidents. It's being used by China against dissidents and human rights activists. It's being used by China in Hong Kong. It's being used by the Belarusian government, amongst many others. And it's also present here. This is not in the book, but it's research I've done separately. Cellebrite has basically been used and purchased by virtually every single Australian government department in the last 10 years, virtually with no conversation, no transparency, no accountability. It's been used by Services Australia against welfare recipients. Some of the reporting that I've been doing in the last few months goes into detail about that, how that's happening, why that's happening. Now, if you haven't heard about that, it's because mostly not a conspiracy, but no one's really reporting on it. And it's again, the normalization of surveillance technology is almost complete. There is growing, I think it partly explains the success of this book, thankfully, that a lot of people are angry and worried about surveillance. That is for sure. Around the world. Not just Israeli surveillance, but surveillance in general. That we're at a stage in our history as humans that even the possibility of having true privacy is either close to dead or dead. For a range of reasons. Whether it's social media, whether it's phone hacking, for lots of other reasons. But a lot of people are worried about what that means for society moving forward. Are we under constant surveillance? Yes. Do we have much control over that? No. Is there a lot of public discussion about it? Not really. Is there basically bipartisan belief in this in Australia? Absolutely there is. This does not make much of a difference whether Scott Morrison or Anthony Albanese is Prime Minister. Doesn't make much of a difference if Donald Trump or Joe Biden is President. This is the problem. When you have the bipartisan nature of mass surveillance, then you have a problem, in my view. I'm not sure how much more time I have. I can keep talking. 5 minutes. 5 minutes. Love it.
Don't forget you got to sign my book.
I will. I'll sign it twice, just for you. I mentioned before one of the reasons I wrote the book was I saw it as a warning. I wanted to make people aware of what's happening, A, but B, as a warning that if we're concerned about the rise of ethno-nationalism globally, which I feel we should be, whether it's in Hungary or Israel or India, then we should also be concerned, in my view, by the rise of the global far right. And it's pretty remarkable and outrageous and shocking that often you have, if you go to far right rallies, which I'm not suggesting you do, but I've gone there for work at times around the world, Australia, US, UK, Europe, you might be surprised to often find the Israeli flag flying at these rallies. Now, to be clear, these are far right groups who are traditionally Nazis. Now, in case you missed the last 100 years of history, Nazis aren't a big fan of Jews. Newsflash. However, there is a deep admiration for many in the global far right towards Israel. Not because they like Jews, but because they admire Israel's ethno-nationalist makeup and want to do something remarkably similar in their own countries to create Christian ethno-nationalist realities. I have a quote in the book from Richard Spencer, who's a notorious alt-right so-called leader from a few years ago, and he said, "I'm a white Zionist." His words. And that should scare you, because he's not saying that because he likes Jews. He's saying that he admires what Israel's doing for Jews and wants to do something remarkably similar, in his case, America, for Christians, and to build a Christian ethno-nationalist state. Now, that you might say that feels like a long way away from America. I would disagree with you. I'm not saying it's about to happen tomorrow or next week. It's not. And nothing is inevitable. History never works that way. But there's a lot of deeply, deeply concerning signs in many countries around the world that either have an election of far-right parties or an admiration of far-right parties or huge amounts of growing public support for far-right parties. And it's pretty clear, as I document in the book, that many of those far-right groups and parties in Europe, including in Spain and Greece and elsewhere, has deep, huge Israeli support. Now, a nation that was born in the ashes of the Holocaust, as Israel clearly was, is essentially openly and happily partnering with far-right groups that traditionally loathe and despise Jews. Now, they would say it's a marriage of convenience, we need to make friends. Okay. But it's an utterly amoral way to see, in my view, the world. And more importantly, it's a deeply shameful legacy for the Jewish people in the 21st century. I don't speak as representing Jewish people. I said I'm an atheist Jew, so I'm not... You don't find me at the synagogue many weekends, let me assure you. But to me, the legacy of the Jewish people in the 21st century cannot be, or should not be, partnering with, supporting, backing, arming, training the worst regimes in the world. Sure, America arms and trains repressive states. So does France, so does Russia, so does the UK. It's not unique to Israel. Absolutely true. The world's biggest arms dealer is America. 40% of the world's arms is American. They're the most amoral arms dealer. I know that, and the book talks about that. But Israel's 10th for a tiny country per population. It's a remarkable outcome. And it's pretty incredible when you realise who they've been supporting and arming and training and funding, that 75 years after Israel's birth, that to me cannot be the Jewish legacy in the 21st century. Thank you.